And our Across Africa report continues with our Rise News Africa contributor, Frankie Edozien. Hey.
Hi, Debbie.
Oh, so you're going to tell us more about this story that we just reported about these two journalists that were found.
Much more sad news. I think a couple of weeks ago we were saying blue skies from Mali. Things have sort of taken a turn for the worse. You know, these two journalists, Gigi Dupont, as her friends called her, and Claude Vernon, they worked for RFI, which is Radio France International, and they had been in Mali for all of the summer, a lot of the time when few journalists had been allowed in there. But what happened to them over the weekend was really just an assassination. They had finished an interview and they were taken away and shot and killed. There was not even a time to demand a ransom or anything like that. This is an area called Kidal. It's a stronghold where the Tuareg separatists are. But we still, at this point, we're not quite sure who's responsible. It is good news that 5 people have been arrested, but it is just talking about the dangers of working in a place that was not really a war zone anymore because things had supposedly turned a corner. Sadly, the journalists had been warned by the French government that things were a little bit shaky over there and asked not to go over there, but they persisted, and they persisted because they had years of experience in Africa. Dupont had covered many countries, including 10 years in DRC Congo, which was also a battleground for a very long time. So she was a very experienced journalist, hardly reckless, and sad to say she's no longer with us.
Yeah, it is so sad indeed. As we reported, they've detained
5 people.
5 people. What's the chances that they'll, really be punished if, in fact, they're guilty of this crime?
Well, one hopes. One really hopes. The French government, actually, they had the movement was so swift. They sent in a helicopter very soon, about 50 minutes after, but they were just too late. And this kind of shows us that this was not really, I don't think this was a thing for ransom. This was a way to punish the French because the French had been the ones who had pushed out the military insurgents out of Mali earlier this year. And so it was, let's get those French citizens, we don't care if they're journalists, and let's just, send the message. Unfortunately, it was the journalists and not the military in the crossfire this time.
Yeah, just so awful. And
tough day for journalism, especially in areas where it's very difficult to get information out. And so what does this mean? Radio is a very effective way of doing that because you can go in like a print journalist with very little equipment. But if journalists and Western journalists aren't allowed to go into this place because they could easily be killed, then very little of this information will come out to the world. So the French troops that are there, I think, have an added responsibility to protect the reporters who are on the ground now.
Yeah, well, and let alone not being allowed to go in, but I'm sure it would discourage, it would bring pause for many journalists who want to go into harm's way like that. Well, we go from one bad story to another one, and this is in more activity by Boko Haram.
Boko Haram has continuing to send the message, except now it's unclear what their message is, because this was a wedding. This was a celebration. This was a Muslim wedding where at least 30 people were slaughtered on Sunday, including the groom. And there is no rhyme or reason or explanation as to why this happened. We know today that there is a video that has been released by Abubakar Shekau, allegedly, because we don't know if it's him, claiming responsibility for the attacks a couple of weeks ago and other things saying that he is going to bring the Nigerian government to its knees. And yet, all we are seeing is more and more death in northern Nigeria. So it's kind of tragic, but at the same time, what does the Boko Haram want? It's unclear at this point. I think even if you had sympathy for them, the fact that they can kill women, children, school, people in class, people in their bedrooms, people getting married, it just does not make sense anymore. And so Nigeria's President Goodluck Jonathan has to have a new strategy, because military response is not working. Something has to be done. What that is, we're not sure yet.
Yeah, and it needs to be found quickly, too, because it seems like that their activities are escalating. Okay, well, let's take a deep breath and let's talk about something much more inspirational, much lighter, and that is, of course, the New York City Marathon was just this past weekend on Sunday.
Wow.
And the Kenyans
wasn't that
prize.
special? Yes, I mean, we've been talking about all the terrible stuff that has happened in Nairobi, so it's good to mention Kenya and talk about winning. So yesterday, Jeffrey Mutai and Priska Jepto, they won the New York City Marathon, both the men and the women's race, in 2 hours. Particularly good news for Jepto because she was also the London Marathon winner and a silver medalist at the Olympics. So she gets an additional $500,000. on top of the $100,000 that she gets. So way to go for Kenyan women.
Absolutely. And after you run 26 miles in that short a period of time, you deserve all the money in the world as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And as I understand, she came back from behind. Did you watch the race?
I did watch the race, and she had a really good strategy because she had run this race before, and she had realized that Central Park was the toughest part for her. And so she really studied the hills of Central Park, and that was where she just overtook the woman who had been in first place all this time. So it was a very strong come from behind win, and a very good day for Kenya. Very good day for Africans, actually.
Absolutely. I hope they're both somewhere, eating a steak and resting in their beds after
Resting their feet at least.
Right. Okay, and this last one's kind of interesting. Alcohol in Africa.
Yes.
Okay, tell me about this.
Africa continues to be this place where people want to have better business. So the makers of Johnny Walker, they also make Smirnoff. They have tried a strategy over the last 2 years in South Africa, and they have seen their profits increase 80%, which is simply making the bottles smaller, just about 6 servings of Johnny Walker. And so now they have introduced the same strategy in Ghana and the same strategy in Nigeria. And their thinking is, instead of thinking of Johnny Walker as perhaps a drink for the middle class or people who are elite, they are marketed it in chop bars, in shebans, which are just basically roadside stalls where people go after work to drink. And people who would not even think of spending, $50 or $40 for a bottle of whiskey, but can afford maybe $3 for a couple of shots.
So this smaller amount is not so much about moderation or whatever the thought might be about drinking. It's really about the cost.
Yes, it's about the cost, and it's about trying to build brand loyalty, trying to say that this is for you as well. You don't always have to be a middle-class person to drink Johnny Walker. Anybody can drink Johnny Walker. And so this is what they're doing. It has worked in South Africa. I'm curious to see if it will work in Ghana, where there's a lot of locally made gin and locally made booze. There's akpateshi, which we talked about in the summer. There's other kinds of moonshine, as it is.
Or hooch, as we call it.
But what they're doing is that they're coming up with all of these tiny little bottles and getting them marketed in places where people can say, okay, I've just had my paycheck and I can have a little bit of Johnny Walker today.
All right, my takeaway sentence from you today is, anybody can have Johnny Walker.
Anybody, Debbie. Anybody.
All right, thank you so much, Frankie.
Thank you, Debbie.
See you next week.
All right.
And you're watching Arise America.